Hello, so I'm going to re-upload this video because I didn't realise I was having montage problems. It was either I set it up wrong or a bug or both, so I'll just take responsibility for it and say I messed up. So the first thing I'll go through is the montage that went wrong, which was the shoot fist montage. Now inside here I had three sections. I had none, fire and attach. That is not how it should have been at all. That's why it wasn't firing. I'm not quite sure why that ended up happening, but it did. So to fix that, I've remade this montage by taking my shoot fist fire animation, right clicking on it, create, and in montage, and then in here dragging across the attach animation, adding it to its own section there. I've renamed the default section to fire, and new montage section, attach, and then I've set the attachment section to the beginning of the attachment animation, and then I've clicked create default, X on that, so we have two separate sections down here. Now this all looks the same as the one that I'm currently using here. That looks the same. Oh, and setting the default group to the upper body as well. So that was the mistake. That's what was wrong with it and why it wouldn't fire on completed or on blend out. So I now can do this without having to use any anim notifiers, but I think I left them on the animations in case I would change my mind at some point. I've been reorganizing the file pathing here. I say that because it's relevant because I've also brought in all the main sort of templates here for first person flying and obviously the third person blueprints and the top down blueprints. I just sort of reorganized it, put all the template stuff in here so that in my blueprints I've just got the third person character that I was working in, which I copied it, well I moved it out, so I've just got the mannequin folder and the blueprints folder that I want, and then I put the third person map into a levels folder there, just so that I know where everything is and I can come to these templates and take things out because I'm going to. So what's next? What else do I need to go over? The only other thing that I've really changed was the fist. The mesh for the fist I have re-imported because I didn't like its origin. It would have worked fine how it was before, but I thought it would make more sense to re-import it. So I did, so I'll go over that quickly. In the character mannequin mesh folder where it lives. So this static hand L, I wanted to re-import it so that it was facing the right way. So to keep this as simple as possible, Unreal Engine likes the X-axis, and to get to it from Blender, on import I've just ticked the front X-axis, and in Blender, when I was exporting this, I decided I wanted to get the origin point just right. So if we select the hand bone, so just like before, we're going to make this fist a separate mesh and remove its armature. I've already made it into a separate mesh here. And so we'll duplicate that mesh, get to the first frame of our fire animation, and apply its armature. Let's go into Z so I can see this a bit better. And then I'll select the hand bone, Shift S, snap the cursor to the selected bone, just there, so that we're right on the point where the hand needs to attach. Then from there, I have grabbed my hand here and tools, set the origin to the 3D cursor of this separate hand mesh. Then I'm going to clear its location so that it's back down on the floor there. And we could rotate it. We don't have to. It doesn't really make too much difference. We could rotate this to point the right way, but the method I'm going to use to fire it doesn't need it to be pointing straight. So I've taken that like that, and then I've just exported it just like before. So let's just do that quickly. FBX, just hand L, selected objects, no animation, face normals, and it shouldn't matter, there are no modifiers on it, so that doesn't really matter. And export. So now let's close Blender before I fry my computer. When I re-import this mesh, I'm going to have force front x-axis, just to make it point the right way with as little effort in Blender as possible. I could rotate it by 90 degrees in Blender and then import it, but it makes just as much sense to force the front x-axis. So in there I'll go to Asset, re-import from the file, and there it is. Now the origin is in the correct place. You might have noticed then it moved back a bit because before I set the origin not quite right. So let's save that, and that's the two main mistakes that I've made. This montage was messed up, and because of that I did a whole bunch of working around it and didn't realize I was doing anything wrong. I just thought the montage wasn't working, and I wanted to change the origin of this fist. So I changed the origin of this fist and made it face the right way, because we're going to be manipulating this fist as not quite as a projectile, but rather as a flying actor. Just save everything quickly. Okay, so to set this fist up, let's go through the basics of this fist. We're going to want to create an actor for our fist here. Just create an actor for it. I've already done that, I don't need this, so that's the score. I've already done that bit. Create an actor. Inside this actor, we're going to want to add a static mesh and set it to it and drag it over onto the default scene component for it to be its root. I have a different way of doing this that I'll come back to in the future, but for now this is the best way to do this, just to get all the basics out of the way. So I've added a static mesh and I've added a camera to it. I've set the static mesh to our just hand L hand, and I've not edited its rotation or anything. Well, I can't because it's the root component. And then I've added a camera to the static mesh that's positioned just above and behind the fist in the viewport here. So what do I need to go through about it? So this hand mesh, the collision for this, I've got it all set up working off of hits now, working on actor on hit. So I've made this a custom query only physics body which ignores pawn and blocks everything else. So that's what I'm going to go with for this, because it ties in a lot with some other physics stuff that I'm doing. Maybe at some point I'll come back and do this with a skeletal mesh, but it gets a little bit more complicated then with the collision and setting things up, and I wanted to make this component dynamic, projectile controllable, so I can change the mesh in and out, and obviously I'll want to be swapping between static meshes and skeletal meshes to do that in a game environment if I'm shooting different projectiles that have different components. And then so yeah, that's the basic collision setup, and I think this camera wants to be, it's not using pawn control rotation or anything like that. I don't think I changed anything but its location. So basic blueprint for the projectile. Let's not do the event graph. Let's just say the very beginning of it, we'll get the instigating actor, which we're going to be setting as our third person character, cast that to the third person character, and set this variable of instigating character, which is a variable of a third person character object. Yeah? So that is the third person character that we're coming from. I think it's an object. So I've set that to third person character object reference. Right. Don't need to change anything else in here for now. That's that stuff in there. And I'll come back to this projectile once I've gone through the logic for firing it. And just before I jump into the third person character and the projectile blueprints, I need to come into the third person animation blueprint retarget, and I'm going to do the unthinkable. I'm going to delete something that I've already shown. I'm going to get rid of these anim notifiers because we're now going to be using the play montage node to be doing what they were doing now that I've got my broken montage fixed. And I've also disconnected this upper body anim blend interpolation logic because now that I've got my montage working, so sorry again about it not being working. I'm not sure if it was me setting it up wrong or if it was a bug moving it between engines, but it has its own interpolation. So that's what I wanted to use in the first place, and it wouldn't work for me because I had an extra section that was causing me trouble. So we have a blend in time and we have a blend out time. We have a trigger time for the blend out time, and you can read this, you can see what it says. That basically just means if it's less than 0, we're going to be blending out in time for the section to finish. And if it's greater than 0, we're going to blend out after we've finished firing the section. Whatever happens, on completed still fires before blend out. It's worth mentioning that. So yeah, this interpolation logic here is pretty much what the montage is now going to do for itself. I decided I'd leave it in because I might find a use for it with other animations doing other things. This is still something that can be done in the animation event graph. The only thing is, if I was going to make it work now and use both interpolations, I'd want to be using this upper body animation boolean that I've made instead of the is aiming and firing. The is firing and has return booleans. I'd want to using this upper body animation bool instead because that's what I'd be using for it. Because in the anim graph, I'm now using the upper body animation bool instead of the upper body animation float, just to instantly swap on the layered blend per bone between the upper body slot and the default state cache on Spino 1, just to keep everything above. That's what I needed to go through quickly in my animation blueprint because it needed to be changed now that I've got a better way of doing things. Okay, while I'm still on the subject of animation, I'm going to go into the third person character and talk about this little setup on tick. First thing to note is the animation instance variable here is a reference to the third person animation blueprint that I've retargeted, and that gets set on event blueprint initialize animation in here, where I try get the pawn owner, cast it to the third person character, and set itself to the anim instance inside the third person character, like so. Okay. Then we also have a character reference here, which is just useful to have, which is the third person character that we're going to be controlling with this animation blueprint. So this could be done in a few different places. You could do this logic on begin play in the third person character, or you could do it here in the animation blueprint. I've chosen to do it here, but you could do it elsewhere. You just need to swap the variables around. But whatever happens, this animation instance, this animation blueprint wants to be set to a variable inside the character, and the animation blueprint wants to have a variable of the character that gets set to whatever we're controlling. Just because it's useful to, it makes it easier to be able to call things up backwards and forwards between the two things whenever we want to, without having to constantly be casting to and from the animation blueprint or to the character from the animation blueprint. So in the third person character, I'm going to be controlling whether we're using the upper body animation blend. Again, this could all be done inside the animation blueprint as well, this bit, but I've just put it here for now because it makes as much sense as anything. Generally on event tick should be avoided if possible, but this isn't particularly complicated logic and it's protected by do-onces, so it shouldn't have too much of a performance hit. But it could be on a timer or a timeline as well, depending on how you have your thing set up. So I've got these two booleans here controlling a branch. When this branch fires true, I'm going to want to be setting the upper body anim blend to true. But I'm not going to want to be constantly spamming that, so it's protected with a do once. So it fires through, it sets the upper body animation boolean value to true once, and then it resets this other do once for when it fires false. If it fires false, we do it the other way around. This starts closed, so that when we're firing through here at the beginning, before anything gets set, this is going to be, neither of these are going to be true, so this is going to fire false. Starts closed, so it's just not going to do anything because we don't need to set this variable. Once we have set this variable so that we have done at least one upper body animation blend, we're going to be able to fire false. So when either of these come up false, we're going to fire through here, do once, will have been reset because we've set the upper body anim blend once, and on that do once, we're going to set the upper body anim to false, and that will then reset our ability to set it to true again if we want to. Now this is an OR boolean at the moment. This could be worked into an AND boolean. You might have various different reasons to be using the upper body animation, like that one particular slot, that one slot here. You might have a dozen different montages that use it, so you'd want to have various different conditions in this OR boolean here, defining whether we can do it or not. But for now, I'm only shooting a fist, and these are the only two variables that are going to be affecting it. So that's the little bit of animation on tick and setting up the animation instance. Right, now for a quick word about collision. So our projectile is a physics body and it's ignoring porn. I already set that bit up. So in the third person character, our capsule component is going to want to be a pawn that ignores physics bodies. I've got this set with custom query only, just like the static mesh, because I only wanted to query. I'm not too worried about its simulation. So that being said, I'm setting it up like this because I want this projectile to fire through pawn capsule components to be able to hit a mesh that is also a physics body, and the mesh will want to have collision enabled query and physics. So that is the collision setup. So the projectile and the mesh will collide with each other, and the capsule component will play no part in this. It might be useful in the future to have the capsule component overlapping the physics body, so you know when the projectile has come close to the character, but sometimes the character mesh might be outside of the capsule component during animation. So for now I'm going to leave it as ignore, just because the overlap method with the capsule isn't all that reliable unless we make the capsule slightly bigger, which I don't want to do right now. So that's the collision setup for this, because I'm going to be dropping another instance of this third person character into the level, shooting the fist at him and demonstrating some different on-hit logic for the projectile with him. So the events. Let's start with aiming. I've created a custom event called shoot fist aim and a custom event called shoot fist cancel, and they happen off pressed and released on the right mouse button, as you can see. So let's go through shoot fist aim first. Because I didn't make an actual aiming animation, I'm just freezing the montage for fire on the first frame. So this is a little bit of a workaround, but it works for what I want to show. So we play montage on the skeletal mesh with a play rate of 0 on the fire section. So we just get that first frame and it never plays through. If I had an aiming animation, the rest of this would all fire off on completed, so that we make sure that we've played the aiming animation and the fist is in position to then be fired. If you were using a gun, this might not be quite as important because the projectile is always going to be coming from the gun, so maybe you would want it to be shooting from the hip. We don't really want to be shooting this fist from the hip because it doesn't look right. So we play that montage, so we just get stuck. We just get stuck in the first frame of the montage. Let's show that. So we press the right mouse button and we're just stuck in this first frame. We don't come out of it. Right. So once we've played the montage, we're stuck in that first frame. Instead of on completed, because I'm just doing a bit of a workaround here, I'm just firing straight through and I'm setting the relative location and rotation of the camera, of the follow camera component. I'm not actually setting the rotation here, but you could mess around with the rotation to make it point exactly where you wanted it to. I'm just offsetting it on its y-axis slightly so that we end up looking over the character's shoulder. Following that, I'm taking the camera boom and I'm reducing its target arm length to 50 so that we zoom in as well. Then I'm setting is aiming to true, because we are now aiming. And if the last projectile fired, which this could be an actor reference, but it's currently a projectile controllable, a reference to this projectile. It could just be an actor reference though. If this is equal to nothing, then I set can fire because I don't want to be firing more than one fist at once. I could take this off. I could just set this to true anyways if I wanted to shoot multiple fists or something like that, but I don't for now. So last projectile fired is equal to nothing, then we can fire. And this is aiming boolean gets fired to true, and on our tick event, which I showed not all that long ago, as this is an OR boolean, as soon as we're aiming, that's going to fire true because we are aiming, and we'll set the upper body animation blend in. Yeah. So, coming back to the aiming. That's the aiming. Now to cancel the aiming, I'm coming through. I've made this is quite a simple event. It just sets is aiming false and resets the transforms back to where they were before. You might not want to do reset relative transform, but I like to try and keep my camera component at 0, 0, 0 and let the camera boom do the work wherever I can. So my follow camera just gets reset to relative. If you have an offset camera already, you're going to want to set that back to whatever your offset relative rotation and location were before. And of course I'm setting the target arm length back to 300 because that's what its default was. And then I set can fire to false, just to make sure. Now if you have a first person mode, you're probably going to want to check this on both events before setting any relative locations or rotations or messing with the target arm length. Because usually if you're in first person, you're already going to be able to aim. I like to set my animations up so that if I'm aiming, it would be aiming as if I'm in first person. So it comes off slightly more realistic. So those are the two aiming functions. Pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward stuff. Yeah. If I was using a proper aiming animation, I would probably set is aiming true at the beginning, so that we get the event tick to fire, and as soon as we start aiming, we're aiming. So we blend into the anim montage. In fact, they'll probably work with it like this. I just put it at the end because that's where I put it for now. So I'll move this back. Make sure that's all hunky-dory. I'm pretty sure that's the way it should work. It should make any difference to anything. Putting is aiming at the front here so that we blend into the montage properly. Sorry, I'm always changing up my blueprints. That's why it's taken me so long to get this video recorded in between my daughter and me playing with things and improving on them. So yeah, we're checking. The main thing is that we're checking if we have first person, we're checking to see if we're in first person before we fire the change on the camera and the camera boom. So that's the aiming function. And of course, we shoot fist aim, we shoot fist cancel aim. Let's just go through that quickly. Press play. Press the right trigger button. We are now aiming. And we'll have set the cam fire boolean. We're stuck in that first frame, and the camera is located just over our right shoulder because we're shooting the left fist. So this seems like the sensible place to put it. And the red dot, as you can see on my other mannequin here, is actually an arrow that's just attached to the camera in front of it because I didn't feel like setting up a crosshair widget. So yeah, that is aiming. We press it, we release it, and we reset it. Okay, now let's go through the firing logic for this. This is a little bit more fiddly when it gets into it. I'm firing off the button press of Q, or rather on the release of the Q button, because it just seems more natural to be firing on release as opposed to firing on press. So we're only going to fire the shoot fist fire if is aiming is true and can fire is true as well. Again, because I'm shooting a fist, I'm checking if we're aiming because I need this. We really need the fist to be playing its animation to spawn in the right place. It will still fly in the right direction, and I'll explain why in just a moment when I go through this custom event. But again, if you were using a gun and you could shoot from the hip, you wouldn't really need to check if this is aiming. But I'm not. I'm shooting a fist, so I want it to be aimed before I can fire. Otherwise, the animations just don't look right chained together. So if we can fire, and we can aim, and boolean, not or, we branch on the release of Q, and we fire shoot fist fire. Now shoot fist fire, this is going to be a little bit of a mouthful to explain. Basically, the first thing we're going to do is say can fire false. I don't want to be firing more than one fist at once, so as soon as we kick off the firing event, we've registered we can fire, we're going to say we can't fire anymore. That's why we're checking the variable of last projectile fired, the actor or reference to the projectile, to make sure as well on the aiming side of things that we can't then set fire to true after we've set it to false and it's firing. So we set the ability to fire to false, then we're going to line trace. Line trace by channel on the visibility channel, line of sight and all that. So I've got my follow camera. I'm getting its world location to make the start of the line trace. And then I'm getting its forward vector, multiplying that by 3000. This would potentially be the range. And I'm adding that multiplied forward vector onto the world location to make the end. So this then creates a location that is 3000 centimeters in front of the world location of the camera. So that's kind of straightforward. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Now, if you want to be only firing your fist, only firing this projectile when we have hit something that we can hit, we would be branching on blocking hit or on the return value, of the line trace by channel. Sorry, I double clicked there. Got some C++ things reading. So we're checking instead of branching, because I want this twist to fire regardless of whether we hit anything. Doing this line trace is just to make sure that if something is close enough, it will fire in the right direction. For what I want to do with this, I could take the line trace out, but then if we were quite close up to something, the fist wouldn't be firing accurately towards the forward vector of the camera. It would be eventually getting to the location at the end of the line trace, which might not even be 3000. It might be much further than that, because the fist is offset to the left slightly, and we're getting a location here. We're getting the forward vector of the follow camera, and that is straightforward from the way we're looking. So while the fist, if it was firing straight, will eventually cross over that line, it might not cross over the line heading straight out from the camera until much further than the desired range. So if we're close enough, I want to be able to pick up this line trace, and instead of turning it off if I don't hit something, I'll just let it fire to that line. And the block, but instead, so I did say this was going to be a bit of a mouthful. instead of stopping it from hitting, I want it to continue firing. So I'm going to select a vector. The two vectors that I'll be selecting between if we get a blocking hit. If we get a blocking hit, I'm just going to use the impact point. So our fist is going to spawn, rotated towards, and fly straight towards the impact point. We could use the location as well here, but I use impact point because even if I wanted to change this onto initial overlap, impact point is going to pull up the location as well. So that's what happens if we hit something with our line trace. If we don't hit something with our line trace, if we don't get a blocking hit and it fires false, we're going to pull out B, and B is the forward vector of the camera added onto the socket location of hand L, which is the fist that I'm firing. So that's from the mesh, get socket location, and this returns the world space location of hand L for me. So I'm going to just choose that. So this is adding the forward vector onto it is going to give me the direction from the hand that it wants to be firing to get towards the center of the screen, which is where we'd probably be aiming, or rather the center of the camera, which is where we'd be aiming. We could add a range onto this as well. We could take this, plug that in there. It would function just the same, but I haven't found a need to. It works just as it is. So those are the two vectors we're choosing from to find a lookout rotation target for when we spawn our projectile. But before we do that, we're going to be setting our skeletal mesh to the mesh with no hand. Now this is why we'd be branching here. If we didn't want to fire the fist, if we weren't going to hit anything, if we didn't pull up a line trace and we wanted to put a very set range on it, so if something's out of range, we can't fire at it, we'd branch here before we set the skeletal mesh, and we'd just branch and off of blocking hit or the return value here, and if that fires false, we would call the cancel aim event so that we could reset the process. Yeah, but if this was true, or you're doing it my way where it just fires regardless of the range, then we'll be setting the skeletal mesh straight afterwards anyways. So we're setting that to the mesh with no hand that got imported, and then we're going to be spawning our projectile actor. Now the spawn location for this wants to be the socket location for hand L, but if we're moving, this is a problem because we're going to collide with the mesh that we've just set up collision for. We're going to have a hit event if we're moving. We're going to run into the fist just as it spawns, and that's going to send it flying off into strange places. So in order to stop that, I could temporarily disable the actor collision while it spawns and starts flying. But if I do that, it means I can't hit anything at point blank. So instead of disabling collision, I'm getting the velocity of our actor. So this is going to return a vector with a length, whoops, not path length, with a vector length of squared, again, can't click today. This is going to return a vector length of somewhere between 0 and the max speed of our character. So that would be in our movement component, and that would be our max walking speed if we're walking, wherever that is, which is 600 by default, I'm pretty sure. Max fly, max custom, wherever our walking speed is. Max walking speed, 600. So this length is going to be, this value here would be somewhere between 0 and 600, depending on if we've just started moving or if we are moving, and how far into the movement we are, if there's any delay on it. So I'm getting this velocity, and then I'm multiplying that by 0.1 to get a much smaller number, because I'm going to then add this velocity onto the socket location before making the start of our find lookout rotation and the spawning point, the spawning location for our projectile actor. So let's just go through the logic for this bit quickly. We're getting the velocity. This is giving us a value between 0 and 600 because our max speed is 600, and that's going to be spread over the 3 axes. So we get our velocity in whatever direction we're moving, and then I'm multiplying that by 0.1 to get a smaller number, because otherwise it's going to spawn 6 meters in front of where it's supposed to be spawning, and I only want it to spawn just a small amount in front so that we can't collide with it. Because chances are, I know this is how I want it set up, is that the projectile is going to be moving fast, is going to be able to move faster than the player character when it's firing. So we get this velocity, we multiply it by 0.1, and we add it to the socket location. Now if we're not moving, if we aren't moving anywhere, this velocity is going to be 0. So we'll multiply 0 by 0.1 and get 0. Then we'll add 0 onto the socket location, and if we're not moving, we'll just spawn the fist where it really wants to be spawned anyways, because there don't seem to be any problems with that. So if we're moving, we get the velocity, multiply it by a decimal to get a smaller number. There is a few ways we could figure this multiplier out, but I don't feel like getting into clamping floats and normalizing things just yet. So 0.1 works well for me. This will put the fist just in front, just far enough for me to be able to not run into it, to stop collision happening where I don't want it to collide. So we're spawning the fist just a little bit in front of its socket location if we're moving, and if we're not moving, we're going to be adding 0 here. So we're just spawning it at its location if we're not moving. So that gives us the start of a find look at rotation. So we can get the fist spawning straight in, pointing in the direction it wants to be pointed in. This is part of the reason why I re-imported the mesh to be facing along the x-axis, so I could have it zeroed out, so I could have the mesh zeroed out in the projectile, so doesn't have any relative rotation to have to mess around or work around, and it just flies straight across the x-axis how it's supposed to, how the game engine's going to pick it up. So we're spawning it at a look at rotation that is going to be, it's looking from the point of spawn to the impact point or the forward vector of the camera from where the socket was spawned. So it's always going to point in the right direction, no matter how we spawn it. As long as we're using this find look at rotation towards the impact point or the forward vector of our camera, it's always going to rotate towards where we're aiming when it spawns. From there, once it's spawned, I'm setting the return value of the spawn projectile to the last projectile fired. This, like I said before, this is currently a reference to the projectile itself, the actor, but this could just be a plain actor reference so that I could use it with other projectiles, and I think in the future I'm probably going to turn this into an array so that I can then cycle through view targets of projectiles. If I was shooting a bow and arrow and a Mr. Mannequin shot 5 arrows in quick succession, while they were flying, I want to be able to cycle through them pressing tab or something like that. So I'd make this last projectile fired into an array or a map maybe, so I can easily pull out and cycle through the indexes of that array and swap view target based on that. So for now, it's just a single variable so that I can't keep firing fists, because making it into an array, I'd need to check to see if our array contained a fist, as opposed to checking if it was equal to, as opposed to checking to see if this variable was equal to something. I'd have to check to see if it was contained and add in more nodes and change the way things work a bit. But to keep it straightforward, this is just a single variable for the moment of last projectile fired. Once we've set that variable, I'm playing the montage of fire, this time with a play rate of 1, with the fire section, of course, on our shoot fist montage, on the skeletal mesh. And then I'm firing straight through, so not on completed and not on blend out or interrupted, but straight through off of it. So as soon as we start playing, I'm checking to see if is shift held. Because if we're holding down shift, I'm going to want to take control of this fist and start flying around with it as if it was a flying character, or rather a flying pawn, even though it's an actor. And so I'll come back to this. I'll come to this set projectile view next. on blend out and on interrupted. On interrupted becomes quite important when you're messing around with montages, because if say our character gets hit by something or something tells another animation to play, our montage is going to get interrupted. So we need to make sure that everything is set up to fire if it gets interrupted. So on blend out and on interrupted, I'm branching to see if we are aiming, because if we still have our aim button down, I want to continue aiming. So if we're not aiming, we don't need to do anything, because it means I will have let go of the right mouse button. But if we are aiming and we have the right mouse button down, I'm going to want to fire shoot fist aim again, so that we go back into the aiming event and we are again frozen in the same montage, but with a play rate of 0. So that's the shoot fist fire. On to set projectile view, which is yet another custom event that I've made for this. This could actually be turned into a function, but I set it up as an event for now. As a boolean, an input of a boolean, just to say whether we are setting to the projectile or whether we are setting from the projectile back to the character. So if we fire true, we're setting view target with blend on our player controller, and the new view target is the last projectile fired. And we're automatically going to find this camera, because there is a setting here, find camera component to view through when used as view target. And we're going to be pushing ourselves into the input priority stack in just a moment. So back here, we set the view target, as I just said, and then we're enabling input. This is what's going to push us into that input priority stack. And this is going to put us above the third person character, because we're a new input into the stack. So we're just going to plonk ourselves straight in there. I'm not going to get too far into the input stack, because this is quite a straightforward project. But that is essentially what it does. We could set where it goes in the stack if we want to, and we could set whether we block everything underneath it if we want to. But we don't need to block everything underneath it, because we're not going to be having the movement is going to end up being overwritten inside our projectile when I get to the logic inside there for controlling it. So that's how we set our view target to. We set our view target to the last projectile fired, is the variable we just set, and we enable our input to the same variable, to the same projectile with our player controller. And on false, we do that in reverse. We set our view target of our controller to a reference of ourself, and then we disable the input of our last projectile fired. And this then gives me the ability to hold shift and be looking through the projectile, and when I let go of it again, come back to the character and just keep swapping backwards and forwards if I want to. So this event's quite important for that. And like I said, this could be used as a function, and it's probably better off being inside the character blueprint. So that is setting the projectile view. We've done firing, we've done aiming. Oh yes, and the left shift button press. So on pressed, I'm setting a boolean that says is shift held to true. I'm checking to see if the last projectile fired is not equal to nothing. So if it is something, I set the projectile view. That's when we press shift. So that's if we're already flying. We say we were holding shift when we fired off the projectile. So say we were holding shift and we've already fired it true. When we release it, because this left shift event is also in the projectile, when we release it, we'd set our view target back, and then when we press it again, we set projectile view if we have a projectile to look through. Yeah. Making sure we've got this condition checked. We could have two separate events, but I just prefer using it on a branch. Then I just tick and untick this box depending what I want to do with it. So that's the shift. That's the little bit on shift. And I'll come back to shoot this reattach once I've gone through the projectile's logic, because there's a fair amount to go through in this projectile.